In 1983, an anonymous family took a trip to Yosemite National Park, and they settled in for the day at an area known as Summit Meadow. The children were frolicking around, playing in the beautiful and unfamiliar terrain, when all of a sudden, something stopped them in their tracks. The children had accidentally stumbled upon a horrifying sight, one that would send shockwaves throughout Yosemite National Park. The children found a thawed human hand and forearm. Naturally, investigators immediately began working to identify these remains, and they also immediately ran into roadblocks. Nobody had been reported missing. They ended up making a recreation of the victim's face, but this produced absolutely no leads whatsoever. The case quickly went cold, and it stayed that way for literal decades. But then, nearly 40 years later, the authorities dropped an absolute bombshell. Finally, in the year 2021, the identity of the Yosemite National Park Jane Doe had been found. And when her name was released to the public, the story behind her disappearance and death instantly became even more bizarre and even more disturbing than it had already been. She was linked to a cult leader who would end up running from the law and then vanishing into thin air. After this, a notorious serial killer would go on to admit to killing her, even providing verifiable details about what happened. And the strangest part is that these two people were completely unconnected, and neither one of them was ever charged with the woman's murder. So with all that said, the obvious question is, what the hell happened here? I'll attempt to answer that and much more in this video. I will be doing my very best to tell the story behind what I believe is the weirdest death in national park history. I don't use the word weird lightly, folks. I mean, a discovery of a human hand in a national park is already weird enough, and then the events that followed made this story literally 1,000 times weirder. And not only is this story incredibly weird, but it's also incredibly disturbing. I find it particularly disturbing that such a tragic tale was launched from within the borders of a national park, which is obviously supposed to be a place of peace and beauty, not a place of death and mystery. You really can't make this one up, folks. And so before we get into these disturbing details, I'd like to keep things fun for just a moment here and tell you about Drink Element. That's right, Drink Element is the sponsor of this video. So it's summer now, you're probably out exercising or doing yard work or just being in the sun, and you're probably sweating a lot. Now, when you sweat a lot, I mean, obviously you want to drink a lot of water and stay hydrated, but that's really not enough. You also need to replace the electrolytes that you're sweating out, because if you don't, you're gonna feel fatigued, you're gonna get muscle cramps. It's really just not good, and it's not healthy. You gotta replace those electrolytes. Drink Element has all of the electrolytes that you need to stay healthy and hydrated, and none of the BS. Drink Element has zero sugar. All it has, like I said there, is the electrolytes that you need, and it also has a great taste. They got flavors like citrus salt, grapefruit salt, orange salt. They even have these like creative kind of outside the box kind of flavors like chocolate salt and mango chili, even an unflavored version if you really don't want any flavor. They all taste so amazing that you really don't want to just try one of them. You want to try all their flavors. So what you can do is head over to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go buy whatever drink mix flavor sounds best to you. I'd recommend starting with citrus salt. That's my favorite personally. And when you do that through my link, when you buy that drink mix through my link, you're going to get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. So you're going to get to try them all. Oh, and I almost forgot, you should try their brand new Element Sparkling, which is a bold 16-ounce can of sparkling electrolyte water. I've been drinking it. It's so refreshing after, like, you know, working out or just doing anything where you sweat, like I said. So go check it out. One more time, that's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or you can click the link at the top of the description. Thank you so much to Drink Element for sponsoring this video, and let's get back into the story. So the year that we're starting off in is 1983. In the spring of that year, an anonymous family did what literally thousands of families had done before them, and would go on to do after them. They took a vacation to the famous Yosemite National Park. So with that said, we're gonna take a trip there now too, although it's not really a vacation, but either way, we're gonna take a trip there as I tell this story. This trip is totally free for you, but you gotta hit that subscribe button, subscribe to the channel, help us get to 1 million subscribers. We've got a long ways to go. Do that, that will cover your admission for this trip. So anyways, at some point during their trip to Yosemite, they stopped at an area that is known as Summit Meadow. Now, I've been to Yosemite National Park before, but I have not been to Summit Meadow. So if you have been there, leave a comment and let us know what it's like. I mean, I would just imagine that it's incredibly beautiful. I mean, even serene, you could say, just like the rest of the park. I mean, after all, Yosemite is one of the most popular national parks in the United States for a reason, right? So this family was just relaxing. They're taking in the scenery of the meadow, and the children in particular were doing what children do, especially on vacation. They were just running around. They're exploring. They're just soaking up the fun of this special and new place for them. But unfortunately, things would not remain fun for very long, because as I told you in the intro, these very children would end up finding something that no child, no person for that matter, should ever have to lay their eyes on. These children discovered a human hand and forearm just tucked away there in the meadow. I mean, just an absolutely horrifying sight. So obviously the family reported this, it was investigated, and it was soon determined that the human remains had been there at least since the previous fall, as they had been frozen over the winter, apparently, and they were like thawing out when they were finally discovered. I mean, just a horrifying, disturbing thing to happen on your vacation. And so as soon as the discovery of the hand and the forearm were reported to the authorities, they obviously began searching for the rest of the body. They searched and they searched, but it would end up taking years before they found anything else connected to this case. So 5 years, actually. 5 years go by after this initial discovery, and then a skull with no jawbone, interestingly enough, was discovered near the area where the hand and the forearm had previously been found by the children. They find this skull, but that was it. The rest of the body was still missing, and perhaps even more disturbingly than that is the fact that the identity of the body was undetermined and missing as well. Investigators poured through missing persons reports, but they didn't find anything that could be linked to the mysterious case in Yosemite National Park. Nobody came forward to report that the remains may have belonged to somebody they knew. I mean, the authorities tried everything. They even made various facial reconstructions, which they then shared with the media, hoping that somebody, anybody, would recognize this woman. All of this effort proved absolutely fruitless, and so after 1988, the case truly went cold. I mean, just continuing to haunt Yosemite with each passing year. Pretty weird, right? Well, wait until you hear this. We're now going to flash forward in time, 38 years in time to be exact. Now, if you subscribe to cover your admission to the trip to Yosemite, it's this time travel, it's already included, but if you didn't subscribe, you can go ahead and do that now, and then that will include your time travel. Okay, ready to time travel? Here we go. Ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, now it's 2021. You heard that right, 2021, and there's a lot of new forensic technology that did not exist in 1983. One of these tools is called forensic genealogy, and I am obviously not an expert on this. I'm far from an expert. My only forensic experience consists of binge watching forensic files when I was in college, but I'm gonna try to do my best to explain this concept in layman's terms. Investigators were able to obtain a DNA profile from the remains that were found, and they were able to use this profile to create like a family tree, right? And so they're studying this family tree, getting closer and closer to the identity of the Yosemite Jane Doe. Through this process, which again, I don't really understand, obviously, they were eventually able to come up with a list of potential matches, and then test DNA from these matches until they were able to confirm that the remains were that of a woman named Patricia Hicks. So, I mean, this is just crazy. 38 years later, and all of a sudden, boom, we have a major break in a cold case that most people had, unfortunately, long since forgotten about. Hopefully by now you're starting to understand why I keep calling this case so weird. And by the way, if you think everything I've said so far isn't weird enough, wait until you hear the backstory of Patricia Hicks and her disappearance. Patricia Hicks was a native of Washington State and was actually born in the 1950s. She was very young, middle school age, I believe, when her brother tragically took his own life, which left a deep impact on the young Patricia, one that she would pretty much never fully recover from. She had a brief marriage in her early adult years before she finally up and left, moving to Merced, California. And once she got there, she met up with a man named Donald Eugene Gibson. I have a feeling that some of you might actually recognize that name, and not for good reason. For those of you that are unfamiliar, I was before I learned about this story, Donald Gibson was, or potentially is, I don't know, he was a famous, or rather infamous, cult leader who began gathering followers in the late 1970s. In 1981, he was arrested and put on trial for drugging and, I'm just gonna say, essaying, you could probably figure out what I mean there, essaying multiple teenage boys, which is just incredibly disturbing. And if it's even possible to make this situation even more disturbing, apparently these assaults would be done as part of his sick, cult ritual. Gibson was found guilty and then subsequently released from custody while he awaited his sentence. And after this happened, he predictably took off. He ran from the law, he never reappeared in court, and he was never seen ever again. Authorities believe that he fled to Mexico after this, but I mean, we're likely never gonna know exactly what happened after he was released by the police. So we know that Patricia Hicks was, in proximity to Gibson. She was kind of in his circle, but we don't really know the extent of her relationship to him. However, it is highly suspected that she was a member of his cult. And interestingly enough, right after Gibson ran from the law and disappeared, so too did Patricia Hicks. According to one of her friends, after Gibson ran away from the law, Patricia took a bus from Merced to Yosemite National Park. The year is 1982, and after she did this, she was never seen alive ever again. And at this point in her life, she was only 27 years old. So her connection to an infamous cult leader is obviously hard to ignore in this case. I mean, it's certainly possible that she was killed by Gibson, or at least by one of his associates or something, but this is only a theory and it has never been proven true. It should be noted that the prosecutor in Gibson's case did say that Gibson would have been capable of violence against anyone who betrayed him, but even with that said, we just don't really have the necessary details to pin her disappearance and her death on Gibson himself. Pretty weird, right? I keep saying that. It's super weird, and folks, the weirdness does not end here, because there are actually a few other potential suspects in Patricia's death, and all of them are every bit as infamous as Donald Eugene Gibson. In fact, one of them even confessed to killing her. With that said, let me introduce you to the monster that is Henry Lee Lucas. Henry Lee Lucas was a serial killer who was convicted of 11 different killings, most of which occurred in the state of Texas. However, like is the case in most serial killers, it seems like, there are many more victims that Lucas is suspected of killing, even though he was never convicted for them. And as you've probably predicted by now, one of these potential suspected victims was Patricia Hicks. Henry Lee Lucas told investigators that in the early 1980s, he noticed a young woman hitchhiking near Yosemite National Park. He allegedly picked her up, drove her to a campsite nearby Summit Meadow, where the two then drank beer, ate fried chicken, and eventually hooked up. After all this happened, because Lucas was a deranged lunatic, he apparently killed her. Now, it should be noted that Lucas confessed to all of this stuff long before Patricia Hicks was identified, and he never actually gave like a real name for this victim. However, investigators did locate an abandoned campsite near Summit Meadow, and this campsite contained beer cans and also scattered chicken bones. And so that obviously seems pretty promising, right? Like this evidence has to be significant. But with all of that said, there is a major red flag here that I have not mentioned yet. After he was arrested, Henry Lucas went on like a confession spree of sorts. He basically realized that he would get special treatment from the police. You know, he'd get things like cigarettes and better food while authorities were investigating his involvement in these alleged murders. He was basically trying to like cheat the system to get this special treatment. And so he would go on to confess to over, ready for it? 600 murders in his life. And most of these murders were quickly proven to be 100% false. It's because of this that his confession to Patricia Hicks' murder is just very difficult to take at face value. But then again, on the other hand, investigators for the National Park Service apparently have come out and publicly stated that they believe he likely had something to do with Patricia Hicks' death. In 2020, the Park Service said, quote, he, referring to Henry Lucas that is, has information about this murder that had not been made public and could only be known by the person who committed the crime. So that seems pretty promising, of course, but unfortunately, Henry Lee Lucas was never charged, let alone convicted, of killing Patricia Hicks, and at this rate, I think it's safe to say that he probably won't ever be. Well, actually, I shouldn't even say probably. I'll say definitely, because in 2001, the 64-year-old Henry Lucas died in prison from congestive heart failure. This was a good 20 years before Patricia Hicks's remains were even identified, and so his death essentially closed the door on the possibility of getting any additional, potentially incriminating evidence out of him. Though he still remains a prime suspect, obviously, believe it or not, there's actually another serial killer that could potentially be linked to Patricia Hicks's death. And this man is perhaps the most infamous serial killer in all of Yosemite National Park history. So, a little while back, I made a video telling the story of Cary Stayner, who would go on to be known as the Yosemite Park Killer after he brutally murdered 4 women near the park in the year 1999. I mentioned at the end of that video that Stayner may have been responsible for more killings than he was actually convicted for, and one of those killings was that of Patricia Hicks. Though Stayner committed his confirmed crimes years after Patricia Hicks had been killed, he too had a strange connection to cult leader Donald Gibson. That's right, we're gonna kind of bring some of this full circle here. Now, it's unclear to me exactly what the connection between the two men was, but Stayner was from Merced, California, and apparently his family actually knew the family of Donald Eugene Gibson. Now, I will say the following details are definitely unconfirmed, just to give a disclaimer here, but I did find a few sources which stated that Patricia Hicks had actually been arrested along with other associates of Gibson in the year 1980. And according to these same sources, she actually testified against Gibson at his trial. But again, I can't confirm whether or not this was true. It seemed a little shaky to me when I was researching it, so take that with a grain of salt. However, since we're already this deep, let's just assume for a second that it is true. And if that's the case, Cary Stayner would have known that she testified, because apparently he actually attended Donald Gibson's trial, again, for unknown reasons. Since it's long been suspected that Cary Stayner had killed more victims than he was ever held responsible for and convicted for, it seems, I don't know, somewhat reasonable, you could say, to suggest that Stayner may have killed Patricia Hicks in retaliation for her testimony against Donald Gibson. And this theory makes even more sense when you consider the fact that Cary Stayner was extremely familiar with Yosemite National Park and obviously would later go on to commit his known murders against visitors and an employee of that park. But with all that said, Cary Stayner never confessed to the killing or even knowing Patricia Hicks for that matter. No hard evidence has ever been found to connect him to her killing. Stayner is still alive in prison as of the making of this video, but unfortunately, it seems unlikely that he will make any more confessions. Now, those are all like the murder theories, the spicy stuff, the disturbing stuff, I guess. But there is one more potential explanation for Patricia Hicks's death. Again, I think that murder and foul play is definitely likely here, especially given her connection to Gibson or even, again, Henry Lucas. But consider just for a moment that maybe her death was actually accidental. I have no idea what the purpose of Patricia's trip to Yosemite was, but I mean, it is a national park after all, and so it's likely that she wanted to experience its natural beauty, of course. In order to do this, it's plausible to assume that she would have been hiking or camping, which opens up the possibility that she fell or became injured in the backcountry and died as a result. Now, after hearing that, you're probably thinking something along the lines of, Kyle, come on, her hand and her arm were found by those children. How could that have happened if her death was an accident? But to that I'll say, consider this. Is it possible that Patricia had a backcountry accident and then her remains were like scavenged by animals in the park, which then led to her arm being separated from the rest of her body? This would also explain why her skull was found without a jawbone and the rest of her body was never found at all. Of course, there's also the, albeit unlikely, possibility that she was killed by an animal in the park. I mean, you got to consider that, of course. Could a bear or a mountain lion have killed her and then kind of scattered her remains afterwards? Again, we don't have any real evidence of this. I'm totally speculating right now, but it certainly is a possibility, even if it's remote. But to play devil's advocate against myself, if those theories were true, it would be a giant coincidence that Patricia just so happened to be tied to the cult leader Gibson and the serial killers Lucas and Stayner. And so because of that, I personally believe that foul play was the most likely scenario that led to her disappearance and her death. But unfortunately, I find it really hard to believe that we're ever gonna get a real answer to this case. But then again, I probably would have said the same thing about learning her identity prior to 2021. So, I don't know. You really never know, guys. So with that said, what do you think happened to Patricia Hicks? Do you think the connection to the cult leader is so obvious that it must play a role in her death? Or do you believe Henry Lucas's confession about killing her? And of course, what do you think about the possibility of her accidentally dying in the backcountry? Hopefully at this point, you all realize why I'm calling this the weirdest death in national park history. The entire story is just so strange, and I hope that someday the world will get some answers about what the hell happened to Patricia Hicks. My heart goes out to Patricia Hicks, and of course to her friends and family. Guys, I'll see all of you next week, and YouTube seems to think that you'd enjoy watching this very video next, so give it a click. And again, thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart, truly, for supporting all of my content.